Today, we're diving headfirst into a really major policy shift. It's fundamentally reshaping global trade as we know it.
Absolutely. We're talking about the United States' new reciprocal tariff regime, specifically those intensified measures that came out in July 2025.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're drawing on a pretty comprehensive report. America's new tariff regime, global trade repercussions, and we've also got insights from news coverage, CNBC TV 18, and BBC News on YouTube.
And our mission today really is to unpack all the complex details. We want to understand the thinking, the rationales behind these big actions, and explore what they mean economically, geopolitically.
Specifically for you, the listener, whether you're, navigating global markets yourself or just trying to figure out why things cost what they do.
Exactly, because this isn't just some minor adjustment.
No, it's a huge break from decades of, trade liberalization, right?
A seismic shift, really. And it hits businesses, supply chains, consumers, everyone worldwide.
So think of this as your essential guide. We're going to break down the how, the why, and importantly, what it might mean for your wallet. Let's get into it.
Okay.
So the U.S. has definitely entered a new phase with its tariff policy. It feels like a fundamental shift.
It really is. The key moment was July 31st, 2025. That's when President Donald J. Trump signed the executive order further modifying the reciprocal tariff rates.
But it wasn't entirely out of the blue, was it? It built on things that happened earlier.
That's right. Measures were already put in place back in April 2025, so this July order intensified things further.
And the stated goal, it's all tied into the America First idea, correct?
Yes. The administration frames it as restructuring global trade to achieve, and this is their phrasing, fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade relationships.
To benefit American workers, farmers, manufacturers.
Right. And explicitly tackling what they call exploding annual U.S. goods trade deficits. National security is also a big part of the justification.
Now, historically, U.S. tariffs had sort of a dual role, didn't they? Revenue and protection.
Correct. Raising money for the government and shielding domestic industries.
But this feels different, a
Yeah.
really profound departure from the liberalization trend we have seen for so long.
Absolutely. Just look at the numbers. The average applied U.S. tariff rate, it shot up. It was about 2.5% in January 2025.
Pretty low.
Very low. By April 2025, estimates put it at 27%, the highest in over a century. It settled a bit by July, down to 18.4%, but still incredibly high compared to recent history.
So what makes this specific shift so different from, say, other protectionist periods in U.S. history?
I think it's the sheer breadth, Previous actions often targeted specific things, maybe the steel industry or just imports from China.
All right, more surgical.
Exactly. Now, these executive orders from April and July, they bring in a universal 10% baseline tariff for a lot of countries.
A starting point, basically.
A starting point, yeah. And then on top of that, you get country-specific rates. And those are based on, the trade deficit with the U.S., but also this idea of strategic alignment.
Okay, strategic alignment. We'll need to unpack that later. But it sounds like a shift from specific targets to tariffs almost being the default.
It's a good way to put it, an almost default application.
And it seems like it's not just about trade balances anymore. There's this strategy being called tariff shoring.
Ah, yes, that's a key element. These tariffs aren't just about correcting imbalances or penalizing practices. They're also being used as, an aggressive form of industrial policy.
Oh, so?
The explicit goal is to push, maybe even compel, foreign companies to invest directly in the U.S. to move their manufacturing here.
And the incentive is avoid the tariffs.
Precisely. The message is clear. Build or manufacture products in our country, and you won't face these duties.
Which naturally raises a huge question. What does this actually do to global production networks? Could it genuinely redraw the map of where things get made?
It's a direct challenge, certainly. It forces companies to rethink that whole globalized supply chain model that's dominated for decades. It's a massive invitation, or maybe pressure, to relocate.
Okay, let's dig into the specifics then. The who, what, when of it all. That July 31st order generally kick in August 7th, 2025.
Generally, yes. But importantly, some tariffs started earlier. It wasn't all simultaneous. It points to a phased, maybe targeted approach.
Like what? Any examples?
Sure. India's 25% tariff, for instance, was reported to start August 1st. Same day, August 1st, the rate on Canadian imports jumped from 25% up to 35%.
Wow, a big jump for Canada.
And also on August 1st, those universal 50% tariffs on semi-finished copper products. That shows a very deliberate product-specific strategy layered on top.
Right. And speaking of products, copper is a big one then. 50% across the board on semi-finished copper and related products, aimed at boosting the U.S. copper industry, presumably.
That's the stated rationale, yes. Strengthening the domestic industry.
What else? What other products are really in the crosshairs?
Well, automobiles and auto parts are definitely key. There were already 25% tariffs on Canadian autos from April 3rd. And then broader 25% tariffs hit other autos and parts starting April 3rd and May 3rd, 2025. Those remain. Plus, steel and aluminum tariffs were hiked to 25% back on March 12th.
So it's complicated. There's a baseline, then country rates, then these specific product tariffs piled on top.
Exactly. Multi-layered is the word.
And they're trying to stop companies from finding loopholes,
Really?
right? Prevent evasion.
Oh, yes. There are some pretty strict measures for that. One is a much higher additional tariff, 40% ad valorem.
Ad valorem meaning based on the value of the goods.
Correct. A percentage based on value. That applies to goods that are transshipped, sent through another country to try and hide their origin.
Okay, that makes sense. And the other big one is eliminating the de minimis exemption. What does that actually mean for, say, someone ordering online?
That's huge. De minimis was the rule that lets small, low-value shipments, think online orders under $800, come into the U.S., often without duties or formal customs checks.
Right, I remember that.
Well, that's gone. Starting August 29, 2025, all shipments, regardless of value, will potentially be subject to tariffs.
Wow, so even a $20 gadget ordered from overseas could get hit.
Potentially, yes. Imagine the paperwork, the processing, not to mention the cost increase for consumers and small businesses. It's designed to close every possible gap.
But here's where it gets, well, kind of confusing, frankly. The complexity seems intense, and there are inconsistencies.
That's putting it mildly. We've seen notable discrepancies in the reported tariff rates for several countries across different official White House documents, let alone news reports. Well, India, for example, is it 25% or 26%? Different sources say different things. Japan, we've seen figures ranging from 15% to 24%. The EU, somewhere between 15% and 20%.
Wait, even official documents disagree. How are businesses supposed to react to that? Are they just scrambling?
It creates enormous uncertainty. How can you plan long-term investments or manage a complex supply chain when you can't even get a clear, consistent tariff rate from the government itself?
It must undermine trust.
Absolutely. It leads to delays, higher compliance costs. It just makes everything harder and riskier. It's a major operational headache.
Okay, let's try to understand the why, then. The rationale, the geopolitics behind all this. The main reason given, as you said, is fixing trade deficits.
Correct. Rectifying those exploding annual U.S. goods trade deficits, establishing fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade. That's the core economic argument from the America First perspective.
But it's not just economics, is it? National security keeps coming up.
Frequently. Tariffs are often framed as essential tools to protect against, quote, foreign threats to the national security and economy.
And there are specific examples given.
Yes. For Canada, that jump to 35% was explicitly linked to stopping the flow of illicit drugs across our northern border, and also cited Canada's continued inaction and retaliation on other issues. The 50% universal tariff on copper is based on an identified threat to national security from imports of copper.
And China?
A 10% additional tariff was specifically tied to China's perceived role in the border crisis. So very direct links being drawn between trade policy and security concerns.
So it's trade deficits, it's national security, and it seems tariffs are also being used as a negotiating tactic.
Explicitly so. They're positioned as a necessary and powerful tool to push other countries into making meaningful trade deals and security agreements.
And part of that is the push for companies to build here, the tariff shoring idea.
Exactly. That's the core incentive offered. Build and manufacture on American soil, and you avoid the tariffs.
The administration points to some deals as successes, right?
They do. They highlight agreements supposedly reached under this pressure.
But framing them as successes, are there downsides to negotiating this way? Using tariffs as the main lever.
That's a critical point. For example, they report the EU agreed to buy $750 billion in U.S. energy and invest $600 billion here by 2028 in exchange for a 15% tariff. Japan reportedly agreed to invest $550 billion and open its markets for a 15% tariff. Indonesia apparently struck a historic trade deal involving a 19% reciprocal tariff and access to critical minerals.
So on paper, those look like wins for the U.S.
Presented as wins, yes. But it also shows a shift away from collaborative negotiation towards a more transactional approach, where concessions are extracted under the threat of tariffs. It's negotiation via leverage, essentially.
And what's really striking is how far the justifications go beyond just, normal trade issues.
Absolutely. It's not just about how many cars or tons of steel are traded.
No, it's linked to national security, like drug flows, as you said, but also geopolitical alignment.
Yes. The rationale given for India's tariff, for example, explicitly mentioned its BRICS membership and ties to Russia.
And even things like financial transparency issues are cited for countries like Switzerland and Serbia.
Apparently so. Financial opacity was mentioned. Which really leads to the question, is trade being weaponized here, turned into a tool to force compliance on broader foreign policy goals?
It certainly seems like it's blurring the lines.
It absolutely represents a deliberate expansion of what trade policy is used for, and while they call it reciprocal...
It doesn't sound very reciprocal in the usual sense.
Well, it's unilateral in its implementation. The U.S. sets the terms. Other countries are basically told, accept these tariffs, negotiate concessions that we deem acceptable, or face even higher duties.
So the U.S. defines the reciprocity.
Pretty much. It's a stark contrast to the multilateral, consensus-based negotiations we used to see under frameworks like the WTO.
Let's talk about those global ripple effects then. Who's actually being hit by this? You said it's broad.
Incredibly broad, affecting somewhere between 70 and 95 countries and territories. The rates are all over the place, from that 10% baseline up to over 40%. It's a complex patchwork.
Any examples of the higher rates?
Sure. Countries like Syria, Laos, Myanmar are facing rates around 40%. Even allies like Switzerland are at 39%, Iraq and Serbia at 35%, and Canada, as we mentioned, 35%.
And China.
China's at 34%, plus that extra 10% related to the border issue we discussed. So effectively even higher for them.
And India, 25% plus that mysterious penalty. The justification there was interesting.
Yes, President Trump's Truth Social post mentioned India's own high tariffs, their obnoxious non-monetary trade barriers, but also their purchases of military gear and energy from Russia.
Which reportedly came as a bolt from the blue in India.
Understandably.
So looking at these examples, India and Russia, Canada and the drug crisis, does it really strongly suggest tariffs are being used punitively to punish countries for things unrelated to trade balances?
The language used certainly points that way, saying India faces a tariff plus a penalty for buying from Russia, or holding Canada accountable for the drug crisis via tariffs. It's quite explicit.
And the criteria for setting these rates?
It's described as a matrix of considerations. That includes the bilateral trade balance, yes, but also domestic content rules, and crucially, that strategic alignment and geopolitical risk.
So countries seen as having large deficits or not being sufficiently aligned strategically?
They face the steepest increases. It clearly links economic penalties to broader political judgments.
Okay, let's shift to the economic reality on the ground. There's a really interesting paradox here, isn't there? These tariffs are projected to bring in a lot of money for the U.S. government.
A staggering amount, actually. Projections were talking over $5.2 trillion in new federal revenue over 10 years.
Trillion.
Trillion, yes, on a conventional basis. And we saw customs duties just explode. They quadrupled in June 2025 alone. For the first 9 months of fiscal year 2025, they hit $113.3 billion gross.
Wow.
And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was projecting that for the full calendar year 2025, collections could reach $300 billion. That would make tariffs the fourth largest source of federal revenue.
A huge revenue generator.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
there's a flip side, right? What about the cost to the overall U.S. economy?
That's the paradox. Despite the revenue windfall for the government, economic models project significant negative impacts. The Penn-Wharton budget model, for example, this was back in April 2025, forecast a long-run reduction in U.S. GDP.
Reduction. By how much?
By about 6%. And a decrease in wages by 5%.
That's substantial.
It is, and they specifically estimated that a middle-income household could face a lifetime loss of around $22,000. And importantly, they stressed these were likely lower bounds. The actual hit could be worse.
So you see those numbers, massive government revenue, but projected hits to GDP, wages, households. It makes you ask, who is really paying the bill for these tariffs in the end?
That's the crucial question, and the consensus among economists is pretty clear. While the importer, the U.S. company buying the goods, pays the tariff initially.
Right. They write the check to customs.
Exactly. But that cost overwhelmingly gets passed down the line. It ends up baked into the prices that American consumers pay for everyday goods, your electronics, your clothes, your groceries. They get more expensive.
Or companies absorb it.
Or companies absorb it, yes, which means lower profit margins. And what do companies do then? They might reduce investment, cut back on hiring, maybe even lower wages or cut jobs.
So it comes back to workers and consumers one way or another.
Pretty much. There's empirical research, for instance, looking at the earlier China tariffs, showing that Chinese exporters passed almost the entire cost burden onto U.S. firms and ultimately U.S. consumers.
So, yes, as a consumer, you are likely paying for this through higher prices.
That's the economic reality.
And the impacts aren't just contained within the U.S., obviously. What about specific sectors overseas? You mentioned India earlier.
Right. Take electronics in India. Apple had ramped up iPhone assembly there, partly to get around the China tariffs. Now those operations face this new 25% U.S. tariff, potentially jeopardizing that whole strategy.
That's a huge potential disruption for Apple in India.
Absolutely. In India's gems and jewelry sector, they export over $10 billion worth to the U.S. They're warning this tariff will inflate costs, cause delays, mess up pricing.
And potentially cost jobs.
Many jobs, they claim. It puts immense pressure on their whole value chain. Also, Indian oil refiners rely heavily on Russian crude imports to make their margins work. They face risks from potential penalties linked to that.
So specific sectors getting hit hard. What about the bigger picture, global trade overall?
Well, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is projecting a contraction in global trade for 2025. Because of this, about 0.2%. That's a sharp turnaround from earlier forecasts that predicted 3% growth.
Complete reversal.
A complete reversal. And North American trade is projected to fall significantly. Exports down 12.6%, imports down 9.6%.
And all of this pressure, it must be forcing companies to rethink their supply chains fundamentally.
It absolutely is. Companies are being compelled to reevaluate where they make things, where they source components. The Apple example in India really highlights how vulnerable these complex global strategies have become.
So it accelerates that trend we were already seeing toward diversification, maybe more regional supply chains?
Yes, exactly. Diversification, regionalization. But that often comes with its own costs. It could lead to higher production costs globally, which again feeds back into consumer prices.
Now, unsurprisingly, all of this has triggered major international reactions, and it's posing huge challenges for the World Trade Organization system.
Widespread condemnation, yes. Many countries see these actions as unilateral, protectionist, and fundamentally unfair.
Have we seen actual retaliation? Countries hitting back with their own tariffs?
Oh, definitely. Canada, for one, responded quickly. They slapped 25% retaliatory tariffs on U.S. cars.
Okay.
And also tariffs on about $30 billion worth of other U.S. goods, steel, aluminum, tools, computers, plus another $30 billion on things like orange juice, peanut butter, wine, a broad list.
So tit for tat. What about the EU?
The EU took a slightly different path. They announced a 90-day suspension of their planned retaliation. That was in response to a temporary pause in some U.S. tariffs, opening a window for negotiation.
But others are pushing back harder.
Yes. Key players like India, China, the UK, Japan, they're formally challenging the U.S. tariffs at the WTO. They argue these are basically safeguard measures disguised as national security actions, and they violate WTO rules.
And India announced its own additional tariffs.
Yes, on about $7.6 billion worth of U.S. products. So definitely push back on multiple fronts.
Which brings us to the WTO itself. How does this challenge the global trade framework?
It's a fundamental challenge. It hits at the core principles. Multilateralism, everyone agreeing on the rules together, non-discrimination, treating trading partners equally, and binding dispute settlement, having a referee to enforce the rules.
And the U.S. argument is national security.
Correct. They invoke Article XT1 of the YATEAT 1994 agreement, which allows exceptions for national security. But other WTO members are basically saying, no, you can't just use that as a blanket excuse for economic protectionism. They flightly reject that interpretation.
And the whole system for settling these disputes, the DSM, it's broken, isn't it?
Critically dysfunctional. The main problem is the appellate body. Think of it as the WTO's Supreme Court. It's been blocked, largely due to U.S. objections over the years.
So what happens if a country wins a case against the U.S. and the U.S. appeals?
The appeal goes into a void. There's no functioning appellate body to hear it, so rulings can't be finalized or enforced.
Which effectively paralyzes the enforcement mechanism.
Exactly. It severely undermines the WTO's credibility and its ability to resolve disputes, even as countries like China are filing cases against these new U.S. tariffs. The main tool is broken.
So could these unilateral actions by the U.S. trigger a wider breakdown? A full-blown trade war? Maybe global economic disorder if other countries just start doing the same thing?
That's the big fear. You could end up in what game theorists call a Nash equilibrium, where everyone imposes tariffs because it seems like the best individual strategy, even though the collective outcome, a global trade war, is worse for everybody.
A downward spiral of protectionism.
Potentially. The erosion of multilateralism, this
Yeah.
increasing weaponization of trade, it really risks fragmenting the global economy along political lines, shifting alliances, and making the world a much less predictable place for trade.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this fascinating, if slightly alarming, deep dive. The core tension seems clear.
It does. On one hand, this new U.S. tariff regime is bringing in record amounts of federal revenue.
Billions, even trillions projected. But on the other hand, economic models predict pretty significant negative impacts on the overall U.S. economy. GDP, wages, household income.
And that burden seems to fall largely on American consumers and businesses through higher prices and potentially fewer jobs or lower wages.
And it represents this really fundamental shift away from decades of multilateralism towards a more bilateral, maybe even unilateral approach, where trade deals are negotiated under threat, often using national security justifications.
Which in turn profoundly challenges the rules-based trading system centered around the WTO.
Right. The stated policy aim is to, quote, take back America's economic sovereignty, boost domestic manufacturing.
That's the goal. But connecting all these pieces, here's something to think about. Will this new regime actually deliver long-term economic prosperity for the U.S.?
Or could backfire. Could it lead to a more adversarial, less predictable global trade landscape, one where geopolitics and economics get tangled up in ways that reshape alliances and international relations for decades?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Something for you to ponder as you continue to watch this unfold and navigate the complexities of global trade.